Welcome to the Sports Playbook, where we discuss solutions to issues that impact sports. I'm your host, Angela Hayslett. Today's guest is Ashley Carter, a success and team building expert and owner of Leadership Athletics and the Coach Ashley Carter LLC. Today, we're going to discuss athlete empowerment, tools for success. Let's get to it. Welcome, Ashley. Thanks for joining us today on the Sports Playbook.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I am absolutely thrilled. I love the message and ideas that you're trying to share with the world. But I do know that there's a lot of pressure in athletics in life, and it can be really overwhelming. In 2021, there was an NCAA survey of student athletes where 38% of women reported feeling mentally exhausted compared to 22% of men, and 29% of women felt overwhelming anxiety, while 12% of men did. And there was 5 college athletes who committed suicide in the spring of 2022. And more recently, NBA player Terrell Terry recently announced his retirement at 22 years of age due to the amount of anxiety that he associated with his sport. So what exactly is happening to today's athletes?
Man, I wish I knew. I think a couple of things. I would say COVID allowed the world to kind of stop in a way where there may have been more distractions with the ability to play and perform consistently with other people, to like stopping and like people just sitting around and really having a moment to look into their own lives and in retrospect of things that are like maybe showing up for them. So I think it's really put a magnifying glass on maybe some of the things that have always been issues, but have been covered up by the ability to perform and receive value and worth from coaches and parents who see them in their performing states. I would say that would probably be the number one thing that I could think of specifically.
And you have 2 businesses, Leadership Athletics and the Coach Ashley Carter LLC. So what did you identify that's missing in athletics that led you to start your businesses?
Absolutely. So just really the foundation of these athletes' identities. So I think first and foremost, really understanding like who they are, what drives their mindset, what things are blocking their mindsets. So for instance, we'll do exercises where what's the definition of mindset? Okay, what are some of the conditions to the beliefs that you have? Because some of the things that you have in your mind have come up because of past experiences or influences. So you may have had a teacher when you were younger that may have said like, hey, this girl is really bossy. Or you've had teachers that may have said, hey, they are really not focused. They talk so much in class, right? And so there are certain stigmas that have been put on you as a young child that I think kind of perpetuates itself over time in your life. And so I think like we've taken on these identities from other people, and we really need to start to think about questioning those things like, are these things true? And then what are things that are really important to me, what I value, who am I even? And if we can start with building that identity, it's really important. So my work spends time focusing on that. The next thing we focus on is the mental skills. So to let athletes know that there are going to be struggles. I think we grow up in a society where we have this concept of no fear, NO fear, which meaning like you shouldn't have any struggles, you shouldn't fail, you shouldn't make mistakes, you shouldn't stress. But the reality is that life is going to provide all of those things for you, whether you want them or not. So we have to instead get our athletes to realize that these things are going to exist. So KNOW fear, and know that they exist. And then we start to create our resiliency plans for how we work through those things. So that would be the mental skills part. And then the last thing we focus on is developing the confidence behind those 2 things. So now that I know who I am, now that I know that things are going to happen and exist, how do I still walk in my own confidence, being able to maybe speak up for some of maybe the things that might come up in my life as far as like, how do I fit into these spaces? How do I need to be treated in these spaces? how do I deserve to be treated in these spaces, and being able to talk about it. So I think those are kind of the three elements that I really focus on, even within my two businesses, to kind of help build from what some of I think the athletes are struggling with now.
The mental skills and confidence piece, are you able to work on that if someone is not able to properly recognize their identity? Can you move on? Is it linear, or do you work on these all at once?
Yes.
How does the process work?
Yeah, I do my best. I do try to start with identity only because if I can build a foundation of removing some of the things that are holding you back as far as who I am, and starting to empower yourself with your self-talk and your self-belief and how you see yourself, I think it really can impact all the other things. But really, I say that people have external expectations that are put on them. And only when they're able to break from those and find their own value on their terms, will they reach higher levels of performance. So with that, there are some athletes that come to me like, hey, I just need to hit better. And so I can get a way for them to just think through a plan or routine or reset that's going to help them in the moments to take every pitch at one time versus like compiling everything onto each other, then they can probably be successful there too, or they are successful there too. So I think I use both.
So it sounds like you have kind of a short-term plan, solution, if you will, and then a long-term plan for athletes in helping kind of reframe their identity, their
Yes.
mindset, and building some confidence. Now, those sound like a lot of the latter part sounds like a lot of time invested or skills. You have to kind of break down or change what has been learned, unlearn some things. So how much time does it take to invest in this type of program? Like, how much work do these athletes have to put into it to see the results?
Absolutely. So it takes 8 weeks to build a muscle. And so I try my best to do all of my programming with my one-on-one athletes over an 8 session plan. So it's an opportunity for them to kind of get an introduction of me. And we always do a pre-call. So we'll go into like the big stuff 8 weeks, but then I usually do a one-on-one with them in the beginning. They get to know me, I get to know them. So yeah, I would say 8 weeks. But I also do this on a scale with college programs, and that's sort of the difference between my two businesses. One is more of the middle school, high school athlete, and one is really focusing on the whole athletic department. So talking to coaches, their teams, even administrators, and then just talking to how they help be leaders to the next group and the next tier, and how we then help them work through their own self-doubt, their own potential, their own purpose, and then how they help their student athletes do the same. So I would say 8 weeks for my individual people, but on my college level, I will work with them either 3 months, 6 months, or the full entire year.
And you're helping prepare them going into a season, but you're starting with the coach. Is that correct?
Yeah, I want to. I would say it hasn't, I've had one client where I've done that, but all the rest of them I've worked with the athletes first. And honestly, I would prefer to start before they start their season, but it doesn't always work out that way. In fact, we're in the middle of softball season, and I have some coaches reaching out like, "Hey, can you help me?" So, so hey, it's again back to the can I get I have a short-term solution, and I also have like do you want to build groundbreaking change in these athletes, or do you want to just kind of put a Band-Aid on it until we can spend more time together? I can do both.
Band-Aid or a long-term solution. And hopefully eventually it's a long-term solution.
Hopefully.
But you'd have to keep coming back, right? Because there's a new crop of athletes every season, and new athletes to work with, and new challenges, I would imagine. I'm curious to know, you have a background in playing softball, coaching softball, so a good amount of experience in the sport. And how did you transition from coaching the sport to coaching these life skills?
That's such a great question. So for me, it happened. It was really a moment after I finished coaching at the University of Washington last year. And so I actually wrote a book about this very thing. But really, I talked a lot about how, when it was announced that I became a new coach of this program, how people were so excited. They would see me on TV, they would tag me in all their posts and all their pictures. And I'm helping these young athletes, just try to reach their full potential. And we had a great time. We're doing really, really great in the season. But on the inside, internally myself, I was struggling through my own self-doubt, my own insecurities, my own ability to not realize my own potential and who I already was before I showed up to that space. So I noticed that the difference in me was different there. And then as I started to self-reflect, I also realized how much of our athletes are struggling with the same thing. Like, they're really great in their club programs and they're one of the best of the best. And then they get to a program where everybody's the best of the best and they start second guessing themselves and start seeing flaws that they didn't have before or didn't notice before. And they're having to compete constantly on a big stage. And so that does a lot to their mental health. That does a lot to their self-esteem. And so I figured, hey, I'm going to spend the next year really diving into how do I help myself? And then how do I help other people? And so that's what I've been doing. I think the one other catalyst that really kind of sprung me to I have to make a change was last year. There was, I think, 9 to 12 suicides in Division I sports in general. So that was one thing that was really concerning. And then trying to go into our inner circle of the school that I was at, we had 600 athletes for one sports psychologist. And that was something that I was like, man, we can spend so much money on equipment and machines. And I mean, we probably spent, I think, $40,000 on a pitching machine, but we have one, and this is one team for one pitching machine, and we had tons of them. So man, if we can spend all that money for one team, we have to do better with training or helping develop the whole person that is the athlete. So I decided I was going to do it. So here I am.
Do you see a culture challenge in athletes communicating what they're feeling, the pressure, the stress? Is that a conversation that a coach typically has or knows how to navigate with their athletes? Not really. They don't really know how to navigate. And I noticed when I started doing this work, why I believe I got some clients right away was their fear of, I don't know how to have this conversation. I don't really know what to do. I can't tell the difference between if they're just tired or it's really something more mental. And so, I want to bring people in. And so thankfully, I was able to facilitate them a little bit on those things. They don't know. And honestly, a lot of us aren't trained as coaches to do much else. We or much of anything really, except for compliance rules, don't break these rules. But as far as how do we navigate through mental health and mental struggles and even sometimes communication and relationship building, we don't really know that much. We only kind of use the things that we have experienced in our own life and maybe how we play the game, how our coach coached us. That's really the training mechanism of coaches at this level, which is a shame because it is a profession where we're impacting athletes' lives every day. So I hope that, more and more it starts to happen. But if not, I'm creating a curriculum just for that. So just wait, coaches, it's coming. Yeah, fantastic. Fantastic. So some kind of program that they'll be able to access.
Absolutely.
I want to talk about one of your episodes on your Own Her Power podcast. And I found it fascinating. You identified 4 goals of athletes, the default goals, process goals, performance goals, and outcome goals. And in the episode, you describe how athletes should hone in on achieving process goals because they're more within their control. Yes. So would you say that athletes, coaches, and critics are getting it wrong and focusing on performance and outcome goals?
Yeah, 100%. And only because I think it goes back to the very first thing we talked about with COVID and why I started my businesses to begin with, is the fact that we're putting performer and our own value together. And so if we didn't have athletes and coaches who combine those things, I think it would be 100% okay to focus on results. But the problem is we're putting results to if we win this championship, then I'm valuable, I'm worthy, I'm seen. Even when it comes to recruiting, there's this I had an athlete I talked to yesterday and her parents, because we're going to maybe work together. And as we were talking, she had an offer with the school, and the school, pretty much brought her on a visit, did all the things. And then they came to watch her play in one tournament, and she didn't have a good outing. And so she didn't have a good outing, and they rescinded the letter of offer of recruitment. And so, what is that sending as a signal to these athletes is that you cannot mess up, you cannot fail, and you have to be perfect every time, because you never know who's watching, you never know who's showing up. And when you make mistakes, like, you're going to lose everything that you've worked hard for. And so that's why it's been so combined to like have these things that it's not great. So now it's like, if we can spend more time, if that coach would have been there the whole day and just said, hey, I really liked this about what you were doing. Here's some things we're going to work on with you. Here's how we see you fitting in. Here's where we see there's some shortfalls. And let's see, can you work on that? She's only a junior. So like, give her the full time of a year to figure it out, like, give her some steps and tools and allow her to work on that. And let's see where she goes. But our athletes don't get that opportunity. And so that's why it's really tough. And so we have to spend more time working on the process. And I think I'm sorry. And I do think the process is important, because what it does is it creates a blueprint. So if I maybe go backwards and something else once again, all I have to do is think about, oh, these are the steps that I took before. I know this already. Let me just try it again. And it gives me an opportunity to do that. So I want to throw that in there.
Well, and the performance and outcomes are like a byproduct of the process, right?
Absolutely.
So the process is what you can control, what you can manage. Yep. And then the outflow of that is the performance or the outcomes. Yes. So I think that's really powerful if we can rehone our focus on the process and what we can control. And right. And that's where we can focus our efforts. Mm-hmm. Coaches are under immense pressure for win-loss records. And so tell me, what do you think? Should we be shifting the way we evaluate coaches as well, or shift their mental focus at least for their priorities as well as athletes?
Yeah, I think that's tough, right? We're a business. We always say, especially college athletics, it's a business. But what I think we should do is, again, giving them an opportunity to demonstrate some sort of growth. And I think also providing certain resources. So this is kind of where my team building expertise comes in, is I believe, again, the system could be different as far as coaches, when you are recruiting athletes. Like, first of all, coaches, do you even know your own coaching style? And do you even know how your voice affects your players? Do you even know the things that you like in a player enough, besides the shiny things that everybody else is going after? If we can pick the people that fit us best, it would be really helpful for you and your program. And I think even the transfer portal and so many things. So getting to know the athlete at an earlier stage, and actually getting to know, do they fit who you are, could maybe also really affect how the outcomes of performance is in the season. So I think that's really important. So I had something else, but I lost it. So yeah.
Kind of like the compatibility of the coach to the athletes, right? And their ability to kind of draw the best out of those athletes is what it sounds like.
Yes. 100%.
So that's really interesting. So shifting these goals, shifting the focus of these goals, potentially can help athletes be successful, and hopefully coaches be successful as well. And that's going to be hard, because we have these metrics upon which we're recruiting athletes, and we're looking at the stats, we're looking at the data, and it is hard to get to know those athletes individually. Do you have any advice for coaches to pick that fit?
Hire someone like me. No.
There you go.
No. I would say, honestly, I think the coach has to do a little bit of inner work. And I think, as hard as it is, because sometimes, when we talk to our athletes about how we're affecting their performance, that's a little bit of it could be an ego hit to the ego a little bit, but it also can do so much. It can transform your program and do so many great things, to just be a little vulnerable with them for a minute, And so I think the ability to really get feedback on how you're affecting other people, and then how you are actually enhancing their performance too. I think getting both of those sides of information can be really helpful. So yeah, I would say that would be the main thing I was going to say. And then what I was going to say earlier was I actually was in a situation where I just took over a Division II program, and I was out recruiting, and I had just come off of my first season, or I don't know, as like the first spring or fall season. So we didn't have a full season yet, but I was just telling them how I was struggling, in my personality type, and how sometimes I can give you direct, decisive information, and some athletes are not ready to receive it in that way. And then I present in a way that some people would say is, a little scary. I've heard before. I mean, whatever. And so I've learned to kind of, recognize that. But what I was trying to do was trying to shift and try to be something that I wasn't. And so luckily I was at a tournament working and recruiting, and there was an older coach there who we sat down like, Coach, I'm really struggling. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do it. And she's like, Ashley, I've watched you this entire time, and you are very direct, but you don't give off any sort of negative energy. You're not saying negative things. You're giving them productive information. And so she said, and sometimes there are some people that don't see your fit with them, and sometimes those people don't fit you, and that's okay. And so in that scenario, I couldn't like get rid of those kids, and they couldn't get rid of me. We had to figure out how to make it work. But if I was able now to communicate, hey, ladies, like when I do this or say this, like this is where it comes from. This is kind of my presence. It's not a hit on you or your ego, or anything that your defining of who your value is. And so after that, though, when it's time for me to recruit, now I figure out how do I find those athletes that fit that sort of type of me versus trying to shift myself to be somebody I'm not.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because when you walk into a new program, you're inheriting some of the existing athletes,
Yeah.
And you can kind of build a program moving forward, but you have to find out a way to make that work.
Yeah.
Can you give us a little example or a taste of like a coaching session or something like you would provide to either coaches or athletes? Give us a little sense of what that's like.
Yeah. So I talked to you about personalities and kind of influences and mindset. So we start with a DISC assessment. I make sure all of my athletes and coaches will take that. So if I'm doing a one-on-one, I like to give them a base of like, hey, these are personality types, and people are different, but they're predictably different. So if I can give you a little insight on the 4 types of people in the world, it's going to make your life easier, and it's going to make you feel better about the people that are around you as well. And so I always tell them that there are definitely 3 things that everybody has. Everybody has strengths, everybody has blind spots, and everybody has primary emotions. And so you might have that coach that comes off really aggressive, always yelling, and just to know that that is probably one personality type. And so we talk through how do we navigate that interaction with those people. So we spend time doing that. And then we go right into let's define mindset. Let's define some of the things that have been repetitive in our lives that have now driven our behaviors and our beliefs thus far. And let's determine, are these things true? Are they not true? And are they useful, or are they not useful? And so once we can get those 2 things out of the way, just the ability to free that weight, it takes them on another journey to be able to move forward to like, okay, now how do I grow, and realizing that I will face these things again? So what are my tools to help me through that? And then I try to, with teams especially, spend time with them in a practice setting, or try to go out to some games so that I can give them some sort of feedback on, hey, I noticed that you were doing this. I noticed that you struggle with this. I know that you're doing really well with this. And let's keep this up. Let's adjust this. And so being able to give them that feedback when they're in the moment, when maybe they're not thinking, but just reacting, it's really helpful too.
Are you able to identify when an athlete is misidentifying something themselves? Is that something you're able, particularly if it's an inner thought or a self-perception, are you able to give that feedback where you can help recognize and correct the problem?
Yes. It's interesting, and not necessarily on the topic that you were talking about, but even when I first go into a room with the team, I usually ask them to introduce themselves to me or in small groups, even though they know each other. And I always say, share with them two strengths and one uniqueness about you. And so I make them say something about themselves to either me or to the group. And I think in those spaces, you'll always hear, oh man, like, I don't know a uniqueness about me, or I don't know my strengths. And, we kind of go through the process of, once they talk it out, I'll say, what's really interesting, why I do this exercise every time is because number one, I don't know you. And this is my first time coming into this space. And anything that you would have said could have been a strength or uniqueness. But in your mind, because maybe you do this all the time, or because you don't feel like it's anything extraordinary, like when we celebrate a home run in a game, these things are like extraordinary things in our minds. When you don't feel like that's what you're representing in this world, then you assume it's not a strength or a uniqueness or a value enough to share. So I have to tell you right away that this is one of the first things that we have to get rid of or work through. And so that would be a really great example. And then I think another thing is that when we're in these spaces, you have certain people that want to answer questions. So I make sure that I call on people and it gets them a little uncomfortable. And I always tell them, which is really true, honestly, I'm like, hey, when I get them to be courageous enough to say something, they most time will say something that is really profound. And I'm like, look, some of the most quietest people have the best things to say. And you know what? Luckily for you guys, I know how to see potential. So I get them to bring it out. So yeah, and then the rest of the time they're like, oh, okay, like and they're really willing to share. So I think those are a couple of ways how I do that.
Well, and I imagine you could probably challenge some of their strengths or they identify are superficial
Yes.
rather than characteristic traits. I imagine you're able to kind of call that out and help them reshift their thinking.
You know what's interesting with girls? They don't have a lot of them don't have superficial much of anything because they're so on the level of like doing things the right way and checking off boxes. So very little do they have that imagination, which we wish and sometimes they had it more.
Oh, actually, that's a really interesting observation.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned earlier working with some maybe junior high school kids, but at what age is this work really important to start?
Yeah, honestly, I really would prefer to work with athletes around eighth grade. It's probably about that time where they're getting ready to have another big transition. They're really getting settled in like travel, whatever sport they play, and they're starting to put investment and time into it, and they're starting to search for colleges, and that's when you'll see them start to, try to push too hard or try to be something that they're not for the sake of. So I would say that.
Fantastic. So if you could, in just kind of a final thoughts, talk about how you measure success in your business and kind of any parting thoughts that you might have for us.
Yeah. Success for me is the ability to help our athletes, again, a break from external expectations, find their own value on their own terms. And what that looks like is my business, Leadership Athletics, was set up to say that, like, I want to help every female athlete lead her own ship, her own journey. So if I can give you the tools and the steps, like to understand, like, this is what I want, this is how I want it to look, this is what I want it to be like. I really got to get them to see their own vision. And I call it like authentic accomplishments. It's the ability to say, like, I've worked hard for this and buy into this and will put everything I have into it. So when I see an athlete who can do that, that's when I know I've done my job. And I would say I've had even athletes who decided that sports wasn't the route. And so one of my most recent clients just got into her college of choice that she really wanted to get into. And she decided and saw her junior year that, softball just wasn't doing it for her in the way that she wanted it to and the way that her parents wanted it to. So we shifted, and that's okay. But when you own that for yourself and now you're still living out your dreams and realizing what those big pictures were, like, that's when I know. And I also say when they stop calling me, asking me for help, that's when I know too.
They flow in the nest. They flow in the nest. Yeah. Well, Ashley, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate all of your wisdom and that you're making a difference for all these athletes in the world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. Thanks to our viewers for joining us today on the Sports Playbook. Our next episode, our guest will be Ray Ellington from the Horizons Edge Sports Complex, who will discuss managing a community sports complex. We will see you then.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.